The Azania People's Organization wants Belinda Magor to leave South Africa. In a voice note that's gone viral on social media, Magor can be heard saying that black men are worse than pit bulls and that black men should be banned, shot and killed. Last week, the South African Human Rights Commission labelled the clip as disturbing as well as deplorable and said they would investigate the incident. She has also been charged with crimen injuria. All right, now still on that story, why is it that 28 years after democracy, racism is still such an issue in South Africa? Well, we're joined now by psychologist Professor Saths Cooper. Professor, good morning and thank you very much for your time.
I wish I could say it's a pleasure. We're dealing with a terrible series of recidivist racism. And it's something that we should all be concerned about.
No, it honestly is concerning because it seems that with the emergence, ever so often with the emergence of such incidents, we're probably reminded that the reconciliation project is far from completion.
Yes, and we're just going into, within the next couple of weeks, we'll be celebrating or reflecting on the 16th of December, which our democratic government instituted as a day of reconciliation. But we're far from that project, because there hasn't been follow-through by successive governments on it, and the institutions charged with doing this indeed paid from the fiscus to ensure the kinds of social cohesion, the kinds of nation building in order to underpin this democracy, create stability and move forward together is simply not there.
So what needs to be done? Because when you speak of recidivism in this instance here, one would have thought that with the likes of Vicky Momberg having been sentenced, I mean, she spent 2 years, it was a 3-year sentence to jail, once suspended, one would have thought that would have been a deterrent, but it wasn't. I mean, we looked at the media space, it was awash with articles, a commentary around racial tolerance, where we should be as a country, how do we move forward, but then out of nowhere, we have another incident, and there'll be another.
Yes, and it's significant, I think, that we've had the Mombergs, now Magor, and previously, a few years back, we had Sparrow.
Yes.
These are all white women, and some, I don't want to generalize about it, but it's significant that if women can harbor this kind of sentiment, then it says that those who suck at their breasts, those who they give rise to, those who are around them, learn this kind of behavior. It's tragic and ought to be stopped. It's also significant that we don't have our education system addressing what we've confronted, the horrors of the past, so that in the present there's not an infection of this kind of bigotry, and that we don't continue to inherit it in the future. You know, I sound like a cracked record when I talk about we need to start early with our children. But if our children are brought up by elders who behave atrociously, then our children have very little chance.
But you could easily have education groups, some of those NPOs coming out to say, let's not racialize the classroom, kids should not see color, we don't need to bring this type of education into our curriculum because it causes some sort of division.
No, that is clear balderdash. We will continue. In the next few years or in the next few months, there'll be another such incident, and we'll have these groups calling themselves civil society groups, but really harboring racist sentiment and hearkening back to their glorious days of apartheid. Let's be very clear. We've come from a terrible past, such a deeply embedded, profoundly impactful past, that those are the people who don't realize their racism. You know, they've grown up in this situation. They've benefited from the fruits of democracy more than the majority have, by far, and yet they have the gall to challenge people on racism. Those who have suffered under racism, the majority, know it when they see it. And thank heaven that the majority is not reacting in the same narrow, bigoted and mindless manner in which these groups tend to defend. You cannot defend the indefensible. You need to understand it. And to understand it, we need to go back into our past. We don't teach history in the way we ought to teach it. It's hopefully the history that will come on in the next year or two will open the veil, if you like, on the past. It's not something that we should be hiding. We don't have the signs anymore that says net verblankers, that you don't belong here. But the signs in our head still tell us certain things. So we need to go beyond that. We need to liberate ourselves from an education that is for servitude, that tells you, ken jou plek, you mustn't fit into something.
Yeah.
Whose reality is that? We're on the southern tip of Africa, not Europe, not Asia, not anywhere else. And we ought to be able to actually cherish that diversity. We'll be a very poor world if everyone looked like me, spoke like me, talked, walked like me, and so on. That diversity is there to be cherished. But that doesn't mean that I should be catapulted into thinking lesser of myself because somebody else has the narrative that dominates our discourse. We use English, and it's easy to lessen other people's views of themselves in the world. You know, the issue of who am I? Who are you? And ultimately, we all have the same biology.
So clearly, when we speak of psychology, it has a greater role to play in countering terrorism, be it your research or even just taking us through how the brain processes bias in this instance, where government could possibly use you a bit more.
Absolutely. And I should point out that we have had significant figures in our history who were psychologists. Verwoerd was a psychologist of note who unleashed this kind of terror that we're seeing all around us. And psychology can be used for good and nefarious purposes. I think the vast majority of psychologists, psychology students are there for good. Sad it is that they don't find themselves in public spaces. Government is not utilizing them within the schools. We don't find them in places where they ought to be helping within the civil, social justice in terms of the law and order and other spaces where they can bridge build rather than increase divisions that are artificial.
Because we honestly need a serious restart here, because if we're going to continuously say they must be sent to prison, it defeats the purpose, because the cycle somehow is not broken. You'll have another being sent to prison or diversity programs. They don't work. We somehow need to break the cycle and reprogram the brain of some of these individuals.
I think most psychologists will agree with you. I think that that's why we believe we need to start at the kindergarten creche level to locate individuals that are going to grow up to be children in school, that are going to grow up to be teenagers, young adults, and leaders in our society to understand I am equal to anybody else. Our freedoms, our protections, our equal provisions for dignity underpin this democracy. If we don't appreciate that, we'll have these outbreaks. We'll have these being defended by persons who say, I don't see color. Of course we do. We do, because it is impossible not to cherish, not to recognize, and not to work with and be with others around you.
Because it's never the idea to not see color, but to celebrate diversity.
Absolutely. And the last time I checked, we're one of the most diverse countries in the world. And we don't seem to do that. We, at all levels, and it's not just them and us, there is a narrow, small minority of persons who, and especially during the infodemic of the pandemic lockdowns, where we went into ourselves, we saw the outpouring of racism. We continue to see it. Any group out there that wants to defend this kind of behavior ought to very seriously be called out and ought not to continue to be regarded as civil society organizations because they're uncivil and are stoking flames that this country doesn't need. We also need the institutions created by this democracy to look after and to promote the equalities, the dignities of all, to stand up and be counted. They tend to be missing at the best of times. They tend to respond to the negative that happens. We don't see the kinds of education programs. We don't see the kinds of reaching out to communities. Indeed, there ought to be a sensitivity for those who believe that they were done down by, and that is anyone who wants to identify as white. If they continue with that special case that they grew up under apartheid to believe in, then they need attention. So we probably need to focus on whites because we assume that because they speak English, they understand English, they are with us. They are not, some of them. The majority, I think, are, and they I think, cringe when these kinds of things happen. But they need to stand up and defend humanity, defend our common humanity, not keep quiet. In moments like this, it is important for those whites who believe in this democracy to stand up and shame those who use whiteness or who claim that privilege and continue to spout utter racism, utter degradation of another human being. And then they say, I was brought up not to look at color. I was brought up to look at equality. Why then are you involved in this? Why then are we having this discussion? If it is indeed true, amnesia is a terrible thing. We need to deal with the reality, and that reality is a stark one. All of us need to put our shoulders to the wheel to ensure that every person is cherished in this society.
No, let's hope that even government would be listening and realize that perhaps they need to focus on the school curriculum, that if these children are coming from racist households, when they come to school, they'll be taught something completely different, will go home and challenge their parents about what they're being taught in school.
Absolutely, and I think that's vital. In some of the institutions I'm involved in, like Robben Island Museum and Freedom Park, the council, the staff is out there to create better understandings, to build bridges, to actually have a more appreciation for where we've come from, so that we don't inherit the nightmares of the past in the future.
Doctor, thank you very much for your time this morning. That is psychologist Professor Saths Cooper.